Thank you very much. It's a great pleasure to be with you all today. Anyone who would like to ask you to please be like I was in school, come sit in the front row. Come, please move to the front if you'd be so kind. Before we dive into the substance, I'd like to do something a little bit unusual, which is I would like to tell you the exact intent and approach to achieving that intent that this session is based on. So our intent is to generate a set of ideas that are robust about how we can advance multilateral collaboration on cybersecurity. I think the discussion this morning, from His Royal Highness to His Excellency the Governor, and so many panelists emphasized that we cannot solve the challenge of cybersecurity acting independently, but only together. So our intent is to generate ideas on this topic, but our approach is to use scenarios to do that, as I will explain, so that the ideas that we generate can be expected to be robust and effective across a wide range of future circumstances that we may face. And so, with no further ado, let's get started. Why should we take a scenario lens to looking at the challenge of cybersecurity? The reason is very straightforward. Scenario planning is about managing uncertainty. And when I began doing this work 20 years ago, you had to persuade people that the future might not be, different. But nowadays, I think it's very clear to all of us that we're living in a different kind of historic period. It's a period that historians call a critical juncture. A critical juncture is not just it's almost become a marketing phrase now, but it's actually a technical term. And what it means is a period of time that is compressed in duration, so a relatively short period of time in which a significant amount of structural change is occurring. And that structural change, of course, you're all witnessing it, but let me just go through very, very quickly. First of all, geopolitically. We are in the midst of a historic geopolitical juncture on the scale of a September 11th, or on the scale of 1989 when the Berlin Wall came down. It is a transformative and an extremely fragile moment. And unfortunately, it's not one that we know the end of. And it's one that is actually very perilous for a whole host of reasons, with huge implications for cybersecurity, of course. At the same time, as if that weren't enough, and I think we would all agree that that is enough, we are in a very, very unusual economic moment, facing in many countries the worst inflation we've seen in 40 or even 80 years, in conjunction with significant challenges to economic growth. And as you know, when those two things occur together, it's called stagflation. And inflation by itself can generate political and social instability, but when combined with slow growth and stagflation, it can be deeply, deeply disruptive. And of course, at the same time, we are watching what we call a geotechnological division of the world. It's become apparent, of course, to great powers, leaders around the world, that technology is the primary source of strategic advantage, and as a result, there is a relentless investment in innovation. But at the same time, there is an increasing realization of the importance of not sharing technological innovation in ways that could create disadvantages. And so we're seeing this geotechnological bifurcation of the world. And again, in the same moment, we're watching all of the dire predictions about climate change that we've all heard for so long begin to emerge so clearly in the data of extreme weather events and their costs. There's also a social transformation underway. Again, sharpened by COVID-19 and the world we've inhabited since, we're seeing different behavior of peoples, particularly with respect to work. And when you marry inequality with the social transformation that you're witnessing, then the grassroots of cybersecurity challenges is also altering. It's coming from new sources, it's coming from new places. And because it has its own economic architecture, it becomes an avenue of opportunity for disenfranchised people around the world. And then finally, the environment itself, of course, as we witness the emergence of the metaverse. By the way, notwithstanding the fact that Meta announced about an hour ago that they're laying off 11,000 people, still it is clear that Web3 and the metaverse are going to matter tremendously. But perhaps the most defining characteristic of the metaverse is that it is fundamentally ungoverned. It is a cross-border environment where, as one of the brilliant speakers this morning emphasized, we are invisible. We can move across borders and we can do things, but there's no agreed governance of the metaverse. From a cybersecurity standpoint, this is a huge challenge. And so when you are encountering that much uncertainty, that is when you use scenario planning. It allows you to consider a wider range of variables, and of course, as you would expect, to take a longer view into the future, which is what we're here to do today. The methodology by which we do it, don't worry, I won't bore you with this, but it's important for you to know that it's very systematic. Some would say even excruciating. We begin by looking at drivers, discrete forces of change that will matter. We aggregate them into what are called dimensions for a given question, in this case, the future of the cyber environment. And then we constellate those two things, those drivers and the dimensions, to construct scenarios. In the case of cybersecurity, I must tell you, the range of drivers that required consideration is extremely vast. It touches almost every variable that we who do foresight for a living, including my panelists, have to look at. Cybersecurity touches all of that across these domains and many others. And so in this particular study, we arrived at three dimensions that represent the crucial uncertainties of the cyber environment. First of all, the structure of market forces turns out to be crucial. Why? Because we know cybersecurity is an ecosystem environment. Private sector actors, individuals, public sector actors, all of them matter tremendously and have remarkable power. And so then the question is, if we look to 2030 or 2035, will the market environment be relatively institutionally governed, or will it be relatively ungoverned, as we expect the metaverse to be? The next dimension we looked at, as you would expect, is great power geotechnological rivalry. We have witnessed in the last 30 years periods of time when that rivalry is denominated in terms of economic competition, which of course makes it more stable. But now we're witnessing in Europe and elsewhere proof of the fact that great power rivalry, when it becomes too intense, can lead to actual conflict and become unstable. And so the second dimension were scenarios where that would be stable, others where it would be unstable. And then finally, and perhaps most interestingly, we looked at individual digital sovereignty. What does that mean? We're in a world now where, of course, all the youngest people in this room know so well, we have extended selves already. That is, we have ourselves, and then we have all the data and the interactions that we have beyond ourselves in the digital environment. The last dimension looks at to what extent 2030, 2035, will individuals have some control over that extended digital self, or to what extent will that be overrun either by government, private sector, or other actors, that individuals will be unable to protect that space. So that's what we explored with the scenarios, and it led to three scenarios, the scenarios that we're going to focus on today, each one addressing those drivers in very, very different ways. That's how you get at the space of uncertainty in a systematic fashion. And so here are those three scenarios. But before I dive into the scenarios, I'd like you to meet our panelists. And I know that you heard the pre-recorded introduction, but I think they merit a more proper one, because really, I feel so grateful to have these two people with me on the stage, as you'll soon see. Gwenda Fong is the Senior Director of Futures for Singapore's Ministry of Communications and Information, where she leads research on the long-term challenges and disruptions in areas of communication, information, and digitalization. But that's just the start. She also holds a concurrent role as the Assistant Chief Executive of the Infocom Media Development Agency of Singapore, where she's responsible for developing national digital readiness efforts. I'm sure everybody in this room understands what a leader Singapore is in that space. So truly, we have a global luminary in the topic that we're discussing today, but I'm still not done. Gwenda previously played a vital role in developing and implementing Singapore's national cybersecurity strategy at the Cybersecurity Agency of Singapore. So Gwenda, we're very grateful to have you with us today. And please welcome.
Thank you.
If you knew the details of their flight itinerary, you would really applaud. So really, they've been through some long journeys. Thank you. Next, we have Pano Yanoyorgos. Our next speaker is an expert in emerging cybersecurity's risks and vulnerabilities from a truly, truly unique perspective, one that I had the privilege during my own time in government of having a special view of. He joins us from the United States, where he's the clinical associate professor at NYU's Center for Global Affairs. He joined the faculty following 8 years in government civil service with the U.S. Air Force And for those of you who know, when it comes to strategy, the US Air Force is one of the leading institutions in the US government as a whole. It is rich in strategic thinking by virtue of the nature of air power. He served as the founding dean of the Air Force Cyber College at Air University. This is a huge honor for somebody so young. And as a research professor at the Air Force Research Institute. In these roles, he participated in Air Force Chief of Staff sponsored projects evaluating cyber power, national security, and military operations for senior military officers. As you probably all know, the Chief of Staff of the Air Force, I've had the privilege to serve myself, is the 4-star person who really runs the US Air Force. I should introduce myself, by the way, Rudolph Lohmeyer. I'm a partner with Kearney. I lead our National Transformations Institute. And before joining Kearney, I had the privilege of serving for 5 years as the Senior Advisor for Long-Term Planning at the US State Department. I almost forgot to tell you that. Okay, so with no further ado, if I may, I'm going to show for you a brief video of our first scenario. And from there, you'll see it's called Surveillance Rivals. We're going to have a discussion of what it means for us in practical terms. Please play the video.
The tense, decoupled 2030 world of surveillance rivals had its roots in the bitter stalemate that defined the inconclusive end of the active conflict in Eastern Europe. The reciprocal imposition of secondary sanctions triggered an acceleration of the decoupling of the world's leading economies. The world is now defined by unstable great power rivalry and starkly divided blocs characterized by divergent regulatory models, particularly with respect to data. For countries and companies operating between the blocs, there is tremendous pressure to choose sides. While there is no active kinetic war between the blocs, asymmetric conflict is relentless and volatile. Attacks are frequent, costly, and largely untraceable. The increasing ubiquity of artificial intelligence in weapon systems has disrupted the traditional norms and rule sets governing interstate conflict. At the same time, an escalation of cyber-enabled espionage and sophisticated information operations has spurred states to institute pervasive surveillance and control of their domestic digital environments. National security, particularly cybersecurity, now trump all other priorities, including citizen privacy. To maximize control, leading powers have cracked down on unregulated cryptocurrencies. National digital currencies are ubiquitous and largely segregated along the lines of the world's major blocs. Thus, in the divided, controlled world of surveillance rivals, countries, companies, and individuals face the pervasive challenges of navigating the contested space between great powers and keeping pace with their escalatory investment in cybersecurity technology.
Great. If you could please bring the presentation. There it is. I think we can all agree that unfortunately such a future world is far too likely, much more likely than any of us would want it to be. A deeply, deeply divided global economy characterized by divergent technical standards and regulatory models, particularly with respect to data, where great power rivalry is relentless and volatile, although it's not kinetic. This is not a world where bullets are being fired. It's an asymmetric world. Deep disruption of the norms and rule sets of interstate conflict has occurred because of AI being so pervasive, because of the extent to which these great powers are investing in it. Individual digital sovereignty, this other domain, as I mentioned, that we explore. In this world, national security trumps all concerns of privacy. Really, privacy is considered a luxury that in a world of such threats, you simply can't afford. So surveillance is pervasive, sophisticated, and largely invisible. It is crucial for governments to watch everyone in their domain to the extent that they can. It's not true for all governments, but it's very true of the great powers. And the cybersecurity innovation environment, which is at the crux of this scenario, is challenging because of its cost. The two wealthiest and most powerful economies in the world are relentlessly competing and raising the bar for the level of sophistication of their tools, leaving many smaller, medium-sized powers far behind. And so with that, we come to our first question. And Gwenda, I'd like to direct it to you. I should say that Gwenda and I are both very proud Stanford alum, so there's no bias there, Pano, but that's why I'm going to let Gwenda answer the first question. If you look at it from an a national perspective, if you think about a nation state considering this environment, what would be its most significant challenges?
Thanks for allowing me the privilege of kicking off the answers. I think the challenge for this scenario for governments is that potentially tech bifurcation or balkanization leads to a much less interoperable world and a much more expensive world potentially. So large countries can, to a certain extent, bank on domestic capability as well as seek dominance in the market and in the standard-setting world in order to shore up its own tech stack and to get rid of tech from undesirable sources, so to speak. But a much smaller state, and I speak from a Singaporean perspective where we are a really small state, we don't have the luxury of that, and small states really do not want to have to choose between sides. If I were to say what is one main concern from this power contestation, is really the issue of fragmentation. Because in a fragmented world, in cybersecurity, a fragmented world is actually a fairly dangerous one, because the calculus changes for superpowers in a fragmented world. And where we have less areas of common interest, then it becomes a much more dangerous world for all of us.
Thank you so much. Pano, the same question for you. From the perspective of a nation state, of course, maybe you and I know large nation states best, what would be the fundamental challenges of this world?
Yeah, thank you for having me, and it's a pleasure to be here. So there's a couple of challenges, and we could spend all day talking about them, but I think one of the greatest challenges when it comes to the surveillance state is the increasing use of artificial intelligence, deepfake technology, and other things. So with consumers and populations around the world being under the assumption that they're constantly being surveilled, it becomes very easy for someone, and it will only increasingly become easy, for fake information to go into the public sphere and manipulate the minds of citizenry with the assumption that the information was gained through a legitimate surveillance program. So that's one challenge of that. So there's the other challenge of political stability being influenced by actual legitimate surveillance projects. So there are academic research centers around the world that will go out, find malware on political activists, dissident presidents' cell phones, and then turn these into marketing tools for their programs, but at the same time causing political instability, in some cases almost toppling governments. So it's also the politicization of existing surveillance programs when they're discovered, when malware is discovered. And those are my, I think,
fascinating. I appreciate it. Actually, you brought us, both of you, all the way back to Michio Kaku's opening comments at this event, that the digital world is in a way so radically different that even politics would change. Gwenda, returning to you, given this sort of escalatory intensity of investment and the cost that would convey for other nation states like the one in which we're sitting and others to sustain parity in terms of cybersecurity, what would it take? How can they keep up?
I think general principles of encouraging interoperability, having standards, and perhaps having a zero trust kind of approach to cybersecurity would be important, especially in a world where countries grow more and more suspicious of one another. So it would allow us to continue to promote and facilitate interoperability while managing the security risks. And let me give you a concrete example of one way that Singapore has done this. Singapore has rolled out a cybersecurity labeling scheme for IoT devices. So it basically means that we have a certain set of standards by which we can rate and assess IoT devices, regardless of where they come from, regardless of who manufactures that. So with such a more objective assessment scheme in place, it encourages manufacturers to basically produce things that are secure by design, and consumers, there is that transparency to consumers, so they can they know what are the cybersecurity features behind a certain device, and they can make an informed choice in terms of purchasing it, and it matters a little bit less, who is behind that. So that's one example of adopting a zero trust approach, and that's something that we're trying to do in our small way, contributing to a safer cyberspace.
Crystal clear. Thank you so much for that. You raised something else. I don't want to throw Pano any curveballs, but I think it's true that in this world, quantum computing would be more likely than any of the other scenarios to be very advanced. Don't worry, that just occurred to me right now. But in general, how do you see medium-sized powers just dealing with the cost challenge of, this is like what we call the cybersecurity dilemma?
Yeah, great question. So I think in some cases, smaller countries, countries that are just starting to enter the digital domain in the same way that the greater powers have entered it over the past couple of decades, have some sort of advantage because the infrastructure might be something that they're just now thinking through. What are their acquisitions and purchases going to be? So it's a good time to really think through, as smaller countries are starting to conduct these purchases, to really think through the security and have the concepts and the security by design in place as part of their contractual obligations to the companies that are more than willing to offer them these services. Another important thing to do is to echo on your point on quantum computing, is to pay attention to what is going on in the world of quantum, cryptographically relevant quantum computers, and any standards that are coming up with the intent of creating quantum-resistant cryptography. So this will be over the next 4 or 5 years, but as smaller countries, even greater powers, are starting to shift or purchase new equipment to have all these new technologies and standards embedded at the start of the purchasing cycle, rather than trying to think through how to bolt on, which is a very expensive endeavor indeed.
Fantastic. By the way, we need to write a paper on this, and I'm not kidding. But okay, that was not a planted idea. Now we come, and by the way, ladies and gentlemen, this next question I want you all to think about as well. This question gets at the crux of this session. And the way I'm going to formulate the question is actually quite important for the panelists, so you'll see. So, Gwenda, if you knew with absolute certainty, we're still in 2022, but if in 2030 the world would be exactly as described in Surveillance Rivals, what do you think, starting today, would be the most productive pathways of multilateral collaboration on cybersecurity? And as you dive into that, I just want to acknowledge to everybody, this kingdom, the country in which we're sitting, deserves tremendous credit for how much work and effort it's putting into advancing collaboration on cybersecurity. Look at this event. In fact, you know what, guys? I think we should applaud. We should thank, because that's what the world needs right now. The world needs somebody to step up and say, we're not making enough progress, let's try to change the game. And that's what the Global Cybersecurity Forum really is. And this question gets at it because we know that there's been a lot of talking, but maybe not as much progress. So in this world, Gwenda, what would be the most productive pathways of progress?
I would say that first, let's look at the broader international legal order. And the one that we have is founded on consensus building, because that is the way that we can build a stable model in the international arena. And we have built institutions to facilitate such consensus building in various domains, such as in trade, in dealing with health, territorial boundaries, and security in the physical realm. So we don't have equivalent in the cyber world right now, but that's why mechanisms or dialogues that we have at the UN, such as the UN Group of Governmental Experts, and more recently the Open-Ended Working Group, these platforms are extremely important to allow that process of consensus building and dialogue, because at the UN, every state, even small states, have a voice. So that's something that I think is important for us to continue to keep at, in order to be able to talk about frameworks and responsible rules of responsible state behavior in cyberspace. So that's something that I think we should continue to work on.
Thank you so much. Pano, Gwenda's point is fair, it's solid, it's unassailable. And at the same time, in this world, we could imagine from a game theory standpoint, there are two big players who might be systematically defecting from consensus. What do you think might be some areas where progress could be made multilaterally if you knew this world were coming?
So I would begin with citizen awareness and also good governance and institutional capabilities within countries. So all countries are going to have surveillance powers. All countries will use them in order to achieve whatever national objectives they have set in their national or grand strategies. So I think it's very important to also have the right governance layers in place to ensure that there are legal checks and balances on the use of these tools in a way to help ensure citizens' privacy, while also having media checks and other forms of checks and balances to ensure that the people feel safe and understand why these technologies are being used to help support their health and safety. Another critical thing is to ensure that governments are funding and developing the right workforce, not attuned just to the cybersecurity problems of today, but also thinking forward of what the technological landscape might look like in the year 2030, and funding programs today to help generate interest and also have the right minds in place to really solve the technical challenges that we already have a severe workforce shortage in today.
Yeah, thank you for that. You know, as you say it, you remind me of a program that we're both familiar with. I know Singapore's a leader in this, but it could be extended. The idea of cross-training national security leaders, cybersecurity leaders, of course, within government, but imagine rotations across governments, right, to build relationships, build social capital. For countries that are aligned, we could rotate cybersecurity policymakers, perhaps from country to country, to build a network of people with shared values. So thank you. Okay, so folks, we're doing something unusual in this session because we know it's the afternoon. We're going to give you a coffee break in the middle. But before you go, and to make sure that you come back, please raise your hand if you promise to return after the coffee break. Wow, okay, tough customer, but he wouldn't lie. I respect that. We're going to make you want to come back, sir. We're going to make you want to come back. We're now going to go to our second scenario, but we're not going to discuss what it means until after the coffee break. So we're going to show you the second scenario. It's radically different than the one you've just seen, and then we're going to return, discuss it, and a third before we close. And so please play the next video. Thank you.
The radically technologized 2030 world of transnational titans evolved as governments around the world struggled to keep pace with the explosive and pervasive advance of technology. It is a digitally saturated world where private sector technology corporations have accrued tremendous power, in many cases taking advantage of political polarization, dysfunction, and rising anti-government populism to expand into previously public sector domains. The economic growth imperative, easing great power tension, and the growing political influence of global technology firms has led governments to ratchet down geopolitical competition and reactivate international trade. In parallel, the private sector lobbied effectively for more flexible regulation of technology and reduced oversight of data management and use. The result is a world of vibrant but unequal economic growth and thriving innovation driven by a great diversity of private corporations. Preeminent among these are global technology giants with vast, high-resolution, and increasingly real-time data assets. Individual control over personal data has eroded and is increasingly a function of one's choice of platform provider. This is also a world of powerful, transnational criminal networks with ever more sophisticated cyber capabilities. As a result, in the world of transnational titans, the global cyber environment is defined by relative stability within the domains of the platform giants, and pervasive insecurity and widespread criminality in the increasingly ungoverned spaces outside of their control.
Great. All right, ladies and gentlemen, this world, a world of weakened governments, where the private sector has filled the vacuum, where governance is reduced, but sophistication of technology has increased. When you come back from your coffee break, we'll discuss what it means. Thank you very much. Please be back in 15 minutes sharp. We're going to start right on the money. Wow. Well, first of all, I'm really impressed in general that so many of you returned, and it means a lot, and also very privileged to see some dear friends in the front row giving a little moral support. Thank you for coming back. I'm trusting that almost all of you were here for the first session, so as I mentioned, we're going to dive right into the discussion of the second scenario. And let's just recap this scenario. Remember, the whole point of scenario planning is that since we can't know the future, the only responsible thing to do in building strategy is to consider a systematic range. And that's what we've done. And in this world, unlike the first one, in which nation states in general and the great powers in particular were so powerful, in this world they're very much not. In fact, they are precisely not. In this scenario, the challenges facing nation states were so great and the pace of technological innovation was so fast that nation states and governments really couldn't keep up. In a way, they became diminished in their relevance. And at the same time, private sector players, through the aggregation of both wealth, financial wealth, but also data and information, became so powerful they started to fill that vacuum. So in the world of transnational titans, market forces are increasingly ungoverned, right? This is high growth, dynamic growth, but very unequal growth, right? There are very few stabilizing mechanisms. Diminished government regulatory power has been a crucial aspect of this increasing transnational power of these corporations. Why? Because even the boundaries of nation states are less relevant. Great power rivalry is slower, it's more stable, it's competitive, because the most powerful economic actors in this scenario are transnational actors. The boards of Alibaba is global. The boards of Alibaba includes Americans, Europeans, and Chinese. And the same is true for Amazon and the new players in 2030 that have emerged. Individual digital sovereignty in this world has been overrun, but not by government. It's become overrun. In fact, it's almost been ceded by consumers to these technology platforms as part of the proposition of their relationship. And there's very limited government oversight over data management and use. And finally, it's a world of dynamic private sector innovation and extreme cyber insecurity in all of the areas that are outside of the boundaries of the largest platform players. It's also a world, because of those seams and those spaces, of extremely sophisticated, active, and powerful transnational criminal networks. So the black market economy and the digital domain is very active and very vibrant. And so, Gwenda, once again, we turn to you for our first question. This is not an easy world for nation states. What stand out to you as the most important challenges of this world for nation states from a perspective of cybersecurity?
Thanks for the question. So I think the most challenging thing in this scenario for nation states is how to manage the power that tech giants have and how to integrate public and private interests. In this scenario, the space is clearly dominated by the tech giants, and they may or may not have the same interests and concerns as states. While some of them hold ties to their home countries, but their political allegiances and values are still evolving, and it's not entirely clear how this would pan out. So today, we still live in a primarily Westphalian, state-centric kind of system where governments hold the power, and we are responsible for providing, for instance, security in the physical space. Yet in the virtual space, it's challenging because most of the infrastructure are built and owned by private sectors, and they, in fact, have a great oversight into the cyber threat landscape and what happens in there. So the challenge really is integrating this Westphalian-based system with the private sector in order to achieve a common outcome.
Fascinating. Thank you so much. Pano, sorry, I'm deep in Gwenda's thought stream. Again, from the perspective of nation states, in context of cybersecurity, including larger nation states, what would be the challenges that stand out for you most?
Yeah, the one point in the scenario that concerned me the most is the unregulated financial space, with the private sector having all this and operating at the seams and shadows outside of the control of government. And the one thing that struck me is that when these things happen, the governance positions of a country weaken because there's less tax revenue being generated and less ability to kind of try and create the mechanisms that would promote regulation and try to help bring back the control of this space to governments. So that's one area. But I do think that, to echo the earlier point, that you need a multi-stakeholder, national approach to solving these problems, so that countries that might have bins of platforms that exist within their own country, within their own national ecosystems, can all work together to at least ensure that the consumers, who at the end of the day are the voters for the platforms, are increasingly likely to go towards those platforms which are built with security in mind and have the best protections for the personal data, so as not to strain governments too much on the amount of resources needed to step away.
Fascinating. You know, you bring out a layer I hadn't even seen in a scenario that we developed, which is perhaps the one hedge against their dominance is the power of consumers to choose. And maybe that competition keeps them honest. So in that context, then, how might multilateral cybersecurity be advanced? In a world where no doubt these great technology powers are going to be resistant to being governed, how might multilateral progress to bring more cyber peace best, most productively, most plausibly be advanced? Gwenda.
I think we need to look at it at a systems policy, a systemic policy issue, right? So earlier we talked about the tech giants having predominance kind of market power, but instead of just thinking about how we can regulate such like concentration risks, could we perhaps think about the different levers that government might be able to bring to bear to the issue? For instance, can we think about what sorts of economic policy levers we might have to address things like competition between different platforms, and how can not just the security resilience piece, but together with economic policy levers come together to work for a world that is better for all of us.
It's funny, Pada, before I pass it to you, in a recent scenario project I did with private sector participants, a similar issue, again, Gwenda, I hadn't connected it until you said what you just said, was that they feel like government is the problem. The private sector player said, we actually can build common and shared standards. It's just government and politics that are disrupting it. So fascinating. Pano, same question for you. How could multilateral progress be most plausibly advanced in this world?
Yeah, I think empowering existing efforts would be one way to do it. So we mentioned the GG in the earlier session, but there are also technical standard setting bodies where a lot of work is being done on new and emerging technologies that could potentially be the area where governments, along with the private sectors within the International Telecommunications Union, for example, can really work on setting the standards that take security and privacy in mind as these new technologies are emerging and being defined. So that could be one solution. But also finding like-minded countries, like-minded states that are political allies and have a willingness to work together to kind of set the tone for the countries that are just emerging and entering the marketplace and potentially being more vulnerable to the drivers that exist within the scenario would be one way to kind of ensure that citizens and governments in those emerging states would have the ability to take in the best in-breed technology that has already been developed by useful partnerships between private sector and governments.
And as you say that, again, things that emerge only when you do a scenario workshop, not when you build scenarios, because now it occurs to me, there's a shared interest between governments on the one hand and these giants on the other against transnational crime. Transnational crime is a common threat that even citizens, consumers would share. Fascinating. Okay, well, thank you so much. I think with that then, let's turn to the next scenario. Scenario 3. Please play the video. Oh no, sorry, we need the disintermediate government video, not this one.
The radically technologized 2030
Sorry.
world of transnational
Hello,
titans
video team.
evolved as
We need
governments
the
around
third
the
video.
world struggled to keep pace.
Sorry. You would have had deja vu. Those two worlds are remarkably similar, very subtle differences. Here we go.
The radically distributed world of disintermediated government grew out of unrelenting pressure on the institutions of governance and the explosive advance of grassroots technological innovation. In the context of deepening strategic challenges, from climate change to national security competition, governments had struggled to meet citizen expectations. In parallel, a wide range of peer-to-peer technology solutions built on various applications of distributed ledger technology have become ubiquitous, allowing individuals to conduct an ever wider range of high-trust interactions without traditional intermediaries. Many countries are under extreme fiscal pressure following an extended period of economic stagnation and financial instability. With their domestic legitimacy increasingly fragile, countries have turned to assertive economic nationalism as a means of reinforcing solidarity. The result is a fragmented and intensely rivalrous geoeconomic and geopolitical environment featuring frequent acts of brinksmanship. Large volumes of economic exchange are beyond the visibility of the government, given the proliferation of unregulated digital currencies. The decreased dependence of individuals on states for economic exchange has in turn weakened many traditional tools of economic statecraft, and cyber competition between states has intensified, breaking into sporadic conflict. Cybercriminals and the networks through which they operate have become increasingly sophisticated, and the boundary between legitimate and illegitimate activity has blurred. The resulting 2030 digital environment of disintermediated government is radically distributed. It is a world that some see as the full realization of individual empowerment, and others see as a precursor to chaos.
Disintermediated government. It's a world where the promise of blockchain has been radically realized. A few key things to notice from that. First of all, huge volumes of economic exchange are now opaque, hard to tax, Pano, to the point you made up the other stuff. Taxation is difficult, visibility, tracking, monitoring is difficult. So this distinction between legitimate activity and illegitimate has become more blurry. And for many, there's a huge political dimension to this blockchain world, right? Because many see it as the ultimate form of individual empowerment. Finally, we're liberated from government. On the other hand, it's got chaos woven into it. And so in that context, great power rivalry is assertive. They're compensating for some of their weakness with new forms of economic nationalism, and it's unstable as a result. So geoeconomic, geopolitical, and cyber competition, very intense between nation states. Individual digital sovereignty, remember the prior two scenarios, those were various ways in which individual digital sovereignty had been overrun. In this world, it's exactly the opposite. Unprecedented DLT-enabled individual control, grassroots technological innovation, and it keeps coming, so governments can't get ahead of it. Predominantly driven by peer-to-peer technology solutions. And so digital oversight is, of course, constrained. The large volumes of data that cannot be monitored by government, and increasingly sophisticated cyber criminals. So in this world where governments can't even sink their teeth into the data sets that they use to create cybersecurity, for nation states, Gwenda, what do you see as some of the key challenges?
I think for this scenario, the key challenge is the rise of citizens and non-government actors as key players. That in itself is okay, but I think the erosion of trust in government would be the key concern. With the weakening influence of governments in cyber governance and a private sector that may or may not prioritize cybersecurity, and with individual digital sovereignty where control is vested in the individual, but whether or not they choose to then leverage on DLTs or other solutions to protect themselves in such a federated kind of environment, I think that would be the key concern.
Fascinating. Pano, same. Nation-state perspective and cybersecurity. If you knew with certainty, that this world were coming, what would be the biggest challenge?
The biggest challenge, obviously, governance. Governance creates the ability for the government to control and provide citizens the services that they would expect, but also provide for security for their citizens is the greatest threat, not only because of the individual relationship between the institutions and the citizenry, but also because of the potential vulnerability to rivals that might exist within a region, within a neighborhood, across the globe, because with citizens not being as easily trusting of their governments, they might become more vulnerable to hybrid threat activities. What governments should consider also is how to kind of look at the DLT technology outside of the financial context that tends to take the landscape and think through how can this technology be leveraged, especially within an Internet of Things environment, to help use this technology to their advantage in a way that will help create a more robust relationship with the citizens that might be developing the technology, but also with the technology as a way to offer services to their citizens.
Thank you so much for that. This next question, very specific to this scenario, it's about institutions. You saw that I opened the presentation with Darren Acemoglu and critical junctures. We also think a lot about Douglas North and how institutions are used to manage uncertainty. In this world, institutions, how would they evolve? In a world where citizens and individuals maybe are less reliant upon institutions to mediate trust, how do you think institutions in this scenario would be most likely to evolve?
I would argue that there is still an important role that institutions can play. So for instance, let's talk about DLT. People think of it as an immutable kind of technology that are impervious to bad actors. But let's take blockchain as an example. So experts agree that the blockchain itself may not be easy to compromise. But there are blockchain adjacent kind of platforms that have been hacked repeatedly. I think in June this year, Bloomberg reported that hackers looted about $100 million from a cryptocurrency bridge. So as cryptocurrency, people trade, and that people want to be able to trade between different types of cryptocurrency. So platforms are now being created to create that bridge, and it's that bridge that is now vulnerable. So the point that I'm raising this up is because I think there is a role for governments in particular to look at these emerging technologies and to understand the issues at an ecosystem, at a systemic level. So while individual things, if left ungoverned, there would still be vulnerabilities that bad actors would seek to compromise, and citizens would be the worst off for it.
Huh. Transaction costs. I never thought of it, Gwenda. So we worked on this scenario so hard. My team is out there. The transaction costs of individuals of brokering between those systems would still create a demand signal for public governance. Thank you for that. Pano, same question for you, sir. How would institutions be likely, or might they evolve in this world?
So in this world, I think attribution might, which is a key challenge in cyberspace today, might actually become less of a problem, because one of the core chains in distributed ledger technology, like public blockchains, for example, is the fact that any transaction, whether it's in cryptocurrency or other transactions, become part of the public sphere for time immemorial. So when it comes to, say, security of systems or other things, this same technology, which might be seen as a vulnerability and a driver for individualization, could also become one of the mechanisms through which behaviors in cyberspace are more easily tracked and understood in order to place responsibility for actions on individuals within the space. At the same time, it creates very difficult transnational problems. So institutionally, I think law enforcement entities, other entities need to come together and think through what it means to have a distributed ledger technology that enables you to store pieces of information that would be legal content across the world on hard drives across the world. So instead of in private data centers, as in the second scenario, they're now that can be regulated and controlled to some extent by government. Having that same information spread across the world becomes a very significant transnational law enforcement challenge. That would be one area where institutions could be built to create a more robust ability to prevent the technology from spinning out of control.
By the way, it's the second time that Pano has given the perfect segue to the third question. I don't know if you're doing it on purpose. If so, I thank you. But every comment you've made has bridged to this need for multilateral collaboration. So quite fascinating. And of course, that's our question. So again, if you wear your head of state hats, but your head of state hats as thinking about multilateral collaboration, and you knew with certainty that this world of disintermediated government was going to be the reality in 2030, what would you see as the most productive pathways of multilateral collaboration on cybersecurity?
I would build on my earlier point about needing to look at things at the ecosystem level, and as well as building on Pano's point about having different law enforcement agencies come together, and an earlier point about multilateral stakeholder engagement. So in such a world, I think it's important not just for different governments to come together to work on something, but different agencies with different domain expertise. So if we talk about crypto issue or ransomware, for instance, it's transnational, it's cross-domain, and a good example that I'd like to bring up is the US counter-ransomware initiative that the US initiated with now a coalition of I think some 36 countries. It's an example of different countries coming together, but also bringing together not just the cyber experts, also the law enforcement experts, as well as people who are familiar with the monetary side, fintech side, because it talks about cryptocurrency and how those things are managed. So I think that's a good example of many different parties coming together to address an increasingly complex kind of issue, which I think we're just going to see more and more of these sorts of issues.
Fascinating. Pano, same question. Productive pathways of multilateral cyber collaboration.
Yeah, I think the first step in the pathway is to identify what we want the world to look like. So I think we might all agree, we might disagree, but all of these scenarios presented today are frightening because they look a lot different from us. So it's kind of thinking of what we want the world to look like and how we can achieve that. So that's step one. Step two is, I think, in an ideal world, it would be stability while also enabling innovation to help citizens take advantage of these new technologies and help inspire people to do the things required to have economic growth as a result of technological innovation. So taking those two things into account, looking at what forums exist today, rather than inventing new multilateral forums, multi-stakeholder regimes, but looking at what exists today, where people that are already engineering the solutions, politicizing the solutions, and trying to dialogues within them, the United Nations and other kind of track 1.5, track 2 dialogues, make dialogues more robust so that we can not have to reinvent new bottles for oldish wine, but try to create mechanisms within those institutions as a way to resolve some of the issues so that we can get to a world where technology is being embraced, not for ill, but for economic prosperity and peaceful resolutions of conflicts.
Thank you for that. It brings us to our final question. We've just got a couple minutes left. I'm going to give you the sort of final word, right? The final question is, looking across these three scenarios, given the discussion we've just had, what stands out to you as, if we can, we're foresight practitioners, so we use a little jargon, most robust? From a multilateral progress perspective, what are some of the most robust actions, the highest priority that you think show greatest promise across the range of scenarios?
So the three scenarios are really interesting because they talked about different power asymmetries in each scenario. You have a state dominant, private sector dominant, and then kind of the individual empowered. And I think we need to do all of the above in terms of what we've talked about, right? So if in addressing a state-dominant kind of world, I think, as I mentioned, we need to continue to have discussions at the UN, various multilateral kind of forums. But while we work towards consensus building on international rules and norms, we know that that is an ideal state that we may not reach in the near term. But nonetheless, I believe that there is consensus on maybe 80% of the solution or of the issues, while there are disagreements on the 20%. Instead of waiting until everyone agrees on 100% of the issues, why can't we make moves on the 80% first? Concrete examples would be to invest in regional capacity building on the 80% that people already agree on. And this is something that Singapore particularly believes in, and that's why we've set up a ASEAN-Singapore Center for Cybersecurity Excellence. And that's one example where we can be able to uplift the capacity and capability of different states on the 80% that we have achieved consensus on. Second point, in terms of to hedge against a scenario where you have stronger private sector players. We talked a lot about this, about bringing in a multi-stakeholder approach. So forums like this, the GCF, other similar kind of conferences internationally, we want to make sure that we bring in the private sector players and have a good and robust discussion between policymakers, industry leaders, to be able to talk about what would be good frameworks and mechanisms for us to move towards the future. And the last part, with emerging kind of grassroots innovations, I think something that we need to work towards is to understand the issues, the emerging issues at the ecosystem level, to be able to identify weak points, to be able to address that holistically.
Fantastic. Thank you. Pano, the last word goes to you, please. We're a little bit over our time, but yeah, what do you strikes you as most robust across these?
Yeah, I think taking initiatives that currently have starts, I really applaud the Singaporean government's consumer labeling initiative for cybersecurity and IoT devices as a really good model for how you can take in what the technology vulnerabilities are and communicate to consumers for what risks they might be taking. The other thing that's happening within the United States, at least, is there's regulation that's evolving in order to try and help governments impose some more costs on the private sector for not managing their cybersecurity correctly. So I think those two, from the government kind of top-down level approach, are good ways to kind of help create some order in the current chaos of cyberspace. More importantly also is things that are happening at the grassroots level, where the technical developers are creating the standards, but also the operational relationships amongst themselves that are really going to define how the technology will be governed in the long run. So identifying pockets of these emerging technologies, like kind of how when the internet was first developed, you had very small groups of scientists who eventually developed a domain name system. John Postel writing IP addresses, resolving in names on note cards and storing them there. And having governments identify these sorts of grassroots efforts and thinking through how can we create a new relationship between governments and these scientists in the way that ICANN was developed in its early stages, the Internet Corporation for Assigned Names and Numbers. So kind of thinking through what's the best way for governments to partner with the private sector, but also having governments use the tools they do have to impose costs on the private sector when cybersecurity is not managed right and there's harm to citizens' safety and health.
Absolutely brilliant. I think one of the most powerful and underutilized modalities of diplomacy is science. Because science is about reality. It's a language we all share. It bridges across borders. It doesn't know politics. What a fantastic place to close. Please give these brilliant people a warm round of applause. And we thank you so much for your attention.